Hey there, I'm coming at you today with a really quick tutorial on how to get a watercolor effect on your fabric. So in my newest design on my mystical mushrooms, if you purchase a kit from me, this will actually be printed onto the fabric. So your fabric will come looking like that. So you will not have to paint on the fabric. But if you purchase the PDF and you want to create this beautiful piece, when you go to transfer your design to the fabric, it will look much like that. So what I want to show you today is just some easy ways to get that kind of watercolor effect behind your mushrooms. And to do this will be the first step. So I will do my painting before I do any stitching on the actual fabric. So every fabric is probably, well, depending on what kind of fabric you're using, they may take ink differently. So the first thing I would suggest is to grab a little bit of scrap fabric. So I found just a couple of little pieces of fabric that I am working on here, and just did some test swatches to see how it absorbs and how it will look. So those don't look like much right now. This fabric actually took the ink a little bit nicer. Like you can kind of see a more watercolored effect on there. So yes, the fabric you're using will determine how it looks. So practice is always a good idea. First thing to note, make sure you're working on a waterproof surface. I'm just on a plastic folding table here, so I'm not too worried about my water and ink going through and wrecking my surface. But if you are working on something a little bit nicer, you might want to put a waterproof barrier down, either a piece of plastic or something in between, so that it doesn't wreck your surface. Okay, so what I'm doing, I am actually working with a watercolor palette that I got at a class that I had taken. You can test again different types of paint to see what works best. I'm gonna just do a combination of a few of these colors to get the blue that I want. So what I like to do, I'm gonna move my good piece out of the way so I don't get it dirty. I'm gonna set that aside for a minute and we'll mix up our inks. So what I like to do first is just take my brush, I wet it, and then I'm gonna just pick up a little bit of color from my palette. These were, if I'm not mistaken, they were wet. Or like the liquid water color paints. But the instructor, she just put them into here and let them dry so that we had our own palettes for class, which I thought was quite brilliant. So I'm gonna add a little bit more. I'm going to add a bit of a darker color to that, but I don't really want to contaminate my two colors. So I'll take this other brush, wet it, and grab this darker color. It will probably darken that up more than I want, but that's okay. And then I'm just going to add a little bit more water to that, mainly because I would rather build up my color as I paint versus putting it on and having it be really, really dark right from the get-go. Okay, so I always keep a paper towel or something I can dab my fabric or my brush if I need to. And now we can get started. So one thing that you can do if you want your color to spread a little bit more on your fabric, you can wet your fabric a little bit first. So you can do that with a spray bottle or another method. But this might also be something that you want to test on your test fabric. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a swatch here. So this is without wetting my fabric first, and you can tell like that it took a lot of color there. It got quite dark. And so this time I'm going to just wet the fabric and kind of like blend it in a little bit. The fabric that I use for my kits, I don't pre-wash it, so it still has whatever kind of stabilizers that came from manufacturing in it. So it definitely, you can tell it has a barrier because you can actually see that water droplet is just sitting on the surface. So depending, I'm sure that probably doesn't allow your ink to settle in the same way. So something to note. But now doing the same thing here, so you can see that gives it a much nicer a much nicer like effect there where I can build that up then versus that where it just absorbed all that color. So I, for this purpose, am going to do wet fabric just because I'd rather it be a little bit more subtle and I can continue to add color as I wish. So I'm just using a regular water bottle. I'm just going to give my fabric a quick spritz. I'm not wetting it too much, just enough so that it has a little bit of a base there. Okay. Now, depending, because I don't really want to paint too much over the mushrooms, not that it really matters, like they'll be covered well with our stitching, but I think I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush just so that I can kind of get into those areas without going too much into the mushrooms and the details. And you'll see I am going to be touching them a little bit, but that will look nicer than if there's a lot of spaces. So one thing to consider too, especially on a piece like this, consider where your light source is coming from and where you want things to be lighter and darker. So in this case, I'm going to paint this area in the middle to be the darkest. And maybe around the outside, I will lighten them up a little bit just so that it has that effect of where the light is actually hitting these leaves and mushrooms. And the other thing too, so even after the fact, when I come in here, if I decide that it's too dark in places, the nice thing is you can literally just take water on your brush and kind of smooth it out. So no worries about that. And there's really no right and wrong to it. Like you don't have to do this painting on the fabric. You certainly can, but it's not a necessity. I just find that in a piece like this, it kind of gives it a little bit more visual interest. So, but you do whatever you want. Okay, so I'm going to pick up a little bit more of the paint here. And I'm picking up like such a small amount and kind of like dabbing it off a little bit too, because now when I put my brush down, it's going to be it's going to be darker than it is in my middle spots there, which is fine. I think that when it starts drying too, it kind of absorbs in different ways. And as I mentioned too, you can always come back with a little bit of water over it to lighten up those spots. So obviously one thing that you want to kind of be aware of and make note of, you don't want to cover your lines to the point that you can't see them. I think I'll be okay here. I'm not painting it on very dark here, so it should be all right. And so some of this, I just want to kind of feather it out because I don't want it to be like, it doesn't have to be a square or a specific shape. It can just kind of give it that effect. So I'm actually really liking how this is looking. I'm going to lighten up this part up here a little bit. So I just put a little bit of water on my brush so that I can kind of feather that out a bit. Because it does seem really dark compared to the other areas, but I need to pick up a little bit more ink anyways. So now I think what I'll do is I'll pick up some of my ink, put it into this next little circle, and then I'm just going to add some more water to it to lighten it up a bit. And then that way, there we go. It's still darker, but it's not quite as dark as that other one was. Okay, so have fun with this process. It's very freeform. You don't have to have it look one way or another. You can kind of do your own thing with it and just play. And like I said, add more water if you need to. This one I feel like I'm going to end up with a much more circular shape than I did with my printed one, but I think it's actually going to look quite lovely. So that one, yeah, you can tell it's a little too perfectly printed on there. It looks great on the finished piece, but at the same time, like doing your own painting on it is going to add such a lovely effect and just another element of magic to your special creation. So anyways, that's the idea with painting on fabric. I'm not going to make you finish watching me here, but if you have questions, do feel free to reach out and enjoy the process.